He's not here this morning with his lapel mic, but we'll deal with the giraffe. Will you turn with me to Luke chapter 4, verse 14? The last time that I spoke, I read the earlier part of this, and I'm actually going to overlap a little bit with what I read last time. These verses from Luke are central to the way that I understand both Jesus and his mission and the church and its mission. So I have a few more things that I would like to say based on these. So Luke chapter 4, beginning with verse 14, it's on page 1546. Page 1546. It says, Jesus returned to the Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everyone spoke well of him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went to the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Everybody spoke well of him, and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote the proverb to me, 'Physician, heal thyself.' Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum." "I tell you the truth," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, and when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him down from the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. I am at the moment indulging in a personal addiction. That addiction is a television series which is a little old right now, called The West Wing. I don't know if any of you are ever fans of The West Wing. I kept hearing about it from my mother when we were living in Kenya and had no ability to watch it. So when I would come home during the summer and visit my parents, I would they had it on DVD, and I would start watching it kind of after dinner or when people had pretty much gone off to bed, and I'd get in 3 or 4 episodes and go to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning. I loved that series, and then right after we got back from Kenya, my parents gave me, or maybe it was while we were still there, they gave me season 4 on DVD, all for my own, and I think I watched 20 episodes in the space of 3 days. I learned recently that it is now available, the whole run of it is available on Netflix. And that was a very dangerous piece of knowledge for me. So, but I now double the time that I'm on the elliptical in the morning because I have my little iPad gadget and I'm watching the series while I'm on the elliptical, and it's very easy to spend 45 minutes instead of 20 because I'm no longer bored out of my skull on the elliptical. It's a fun series for a lot of reasons. It's often very, very inspiring, and you fall in love with the characters. But one of the things that they constantly grapple with in that series is, do we speak the truth as we know it? Do we tell people what we think is right? Or do we refashion the message in order to tell people what they want to hear? They struggle with this again and again, and sometimes they make the wrong choice, the tactically wrong choice. Sometimes they learn that they ought to have just spoken the truth because they would have done better than if they had tried to pander to people, and pandering to people backfired. At other times, they speak the truth even when they think it's going to be politically damaging. And sometimes they're right, it is politically damaging. And sometimes they're wrong. It turns out that people appreciate hearing the truth. They appreciate hearing about the priorities that this particular administration thinks are important for the country, even when they're not popular, even when they cost people something. They find that people will actually pay attention when they're being asked to serve the common good somehow, when the popular wisdom or the cable TV news wisdom is that the common good is a crock. Jesus is struggling with exactly that problem here, as does Jeremiah in the first chapter of Jeremiah. Now, if you've ever read Jeremiah, you'll realize that he got over his PR phobia very early and spent the rest of his career saying lots of things that nobody wanted to hear. Shyness about speaking the truth as he saw it was not one of Jeremiah's faults after the first chapter here, when God simply says, you're just going to go speak what I tell you to speak and not worry about the consequences. Luke's telling of Jesus' return to Nazareth is very, very interesting. And there's a funny detail in there. We're used to hearing the story this way. Jesus came back, he began speaking, he couldn't perform the miracles, and so people rejected him. Luke's telling, however, is a little different. He begins by quoting this wonderful passage from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for prisoners, or freedom for captives, and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And everybody loved it. They said, here's our hometown boy. He's come back. He's made good. He knows how to speak. We're interested to hear what he has to say. Listen to the gracious words coming from his lips. And the one who brings up the notion of not being accepted in your hometown is Jesus. They've given him, in this version, a warm welcome. They've said, we like what you're saying. We're interested. We want to hear more. And Jesus is the one who almost antagonizes them by warning them that it's not going to go nearly as smoothly as you think it is. Why would that be? Why would he not accept the good relations he has in his hometown? Why would he not accept the welcome that's given to him? Why would he not accept this praise and capitalize on it and use that good favor to get people thinking about a pretty provocative passage and what it might mean for God's will for the people of Israel, God's will for himself? Why would he almost work to antagonize them? Jesus brings up an issue that so far has not been raised, but I think this is key. This passage from Isaiah about the freedom for captives and release for prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind and release for the oppressed and proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. These were hot words in Jesus' day because the Jews of Jesus' time in Palestine saw themselves as oppressed. themselves as in prison, themselves as impoverished. They saw themselves as living a restricted, constricted life where they were the have-nots, and the Roman occupiers and the Greek business interests that came with them were making their lives miserable. So when they heard these words, they thought they applied to them. And the punchline is this notion of the year of the Lord's favor. When Isaiah and other Old Testament prophets talk about the year of the Lord's favor, they're talking about what's sometimes called the year of Jubilee. It's supposed to happen once every 49 or 50 years, where all debts are forgiven, where anything that I've borrowed from you I have to return, even if it was my father or my grandfather who borrowed it. All land had to revert to the ownership. Whoever owned it 50 years previously was supposed to get it back. These are really radical ideas in their own time. Scholars say that they were probably never actually really carried out, and a lot of Christians breathe a sigh of relief at this. But in Jesus' day, Jews in general, and the kind of hillbilly, half-breed, not very observant, but very impoverished Jews of the Galilee in particular, heard these words as saying, we're going to get ours. Our current miserable situation is going to be reversed. We're going to kick the you-know-what's out, and our land is going to be ours again. God is going to act in our favor because we are the poor, the blind, the oppressed, and whatever. Jesus' words about God acting on behalf of foreigners would not have been welcome to this audience. Jesus preaches to this audience the gospel he preaches everywhere else, but he adds a very odd note here, suggesting that these words don't just apply to you, and I'm not just here to tell you what you already believe. I'm here to stretch your understanding of who God is. I'm here to break apart the boundaries or the fences you build around yourselves when you believe that God favors us and not others. Jesus is suggesting here that this overturning, this proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, doesn't only apply to this small community, which might perhaps be a little bit self-pitying, a little bit stuck in their own sense of being victimized. Jesus is saying, if you want to see God's action, you need to lift your eyes to a farther horizon. You need to lift your eyes and see more broadly that God does not only act in favor of me and mine, but God acts in favor of the foreigner, sometimes first. Jesus is beginning to make the suggestion that he will make again and again, and that becomes the main theme of the Acts of the Apostles, written by the same person. A theme that God is breaking the hedge, or breaking the walls that his covenant previously erected between the people of Israel and everybody else. Through Jesus, God is saying that my promises to the people of Israel apply to all of humanity. My promises to the people of Israel apply particularly to those whom you may dislike. The choice of the example of the widow from Sidon is no accident. Sidon was inhabited by the Phoenicians, who were age-old rivals of the Jews. They were related to the Canaanites, who were in the land when when the people of Israel first entered the land and took much of it over. They cohabited together, these two peoples, with great tension and often eruptions of violence and warfare over thousands of years. For thousands of years, they could not get along together. It would be as if my Catholic cousins in Northern Ireland were being told by God that he was going to reach out to the Protestants first. These are peoples with ancient enmities. In Jesus' day, Sidon was a city inhabited by Greek merchants who the Jews thought of as being highly exploitative, coming in and extracting natural resources, exploiting human resources, selling products abroad when people at home didn't have enough to eat, and profiting off the whole thing without any of the profit coming to the people on whose land the products were being raised and by whose labor they were being harvested, or whatever. So Jesus was particularly picking on folks who his cousins in the Galilee were not interested in hearing God wanted anything to do with. Jesus claimed the opportunity to state the gospel, to state the good news in its most difficult aspects. He did not choose to smooth over the implications of this passage from Isaiah. In fact, he ratcheted it up a little bit. He raised the stakes. He's suggesting to his own family, his own neighbors, that if you really listen to the words that the prophet Isaiah handed us, you're going to have to begin to drop your hostility to the foreigner and the stranger, even though it's going to cost you. Even though you yourselves are suspicious, because as Galileans you're considered sort of half foreign anyway. Jesus is warning them against assimilating. He's warning them against just being like the rest of the Jewish community and hearing these words the way they've always been heard. Jeremiah is doing the same thing. God is telling Jeremiah, you need to speak the words that are going to prick people's consciences rather than the words that are just going to comfort them. I think this is crucial for the church. There is no doubt that lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of us need to hear the words of God's comfort and the words of God's healing. That's part of the church's mission. I've spoken previously about the healing mission of the church. At the same time, there is a tendency in the church, because we're interested in getting more members, because we don't want to appear too different, we don't want to frighten people away, that we might smooth over some of the sharp edges of the gospel. Last weekend, I participated in some celebrations for my friend Troy Jackson, who has been pastor of University Christian Church for many years. The University Christian Church comes out of a denominational tradition that is very evangelical, very focused on personal salvation, very focused on a direct relationship with God through Jesus. And Troy's message for years has been, if that's what you believe, if that's what you practice, if your faith is centered around God's work in Jesus through the cross, if your faith is centered around a personal relationship with Jesus, you must pay attention with obedience to the claims of biblical justice. Troy's life work has been getting evangelicals to pay attention to issues like poverty, issues like the persecution of immigrants, issues issues that pay attention to people in our society, people in our culture who are excluded, who are oppressed, who are persecuted, who are treated badly. Again and again, Troy has drawn the attention of his congregation, particularly to those prophetic passages in the Old Testament that are summed up in this passage that Jesus reads here. If you're a follower of Jesus, if you claim salvation, if you claim to have benefited from the work of the cross, you then must do and must act the way the Old Testament prophets demanded we act towards the poor, the fatherless, the widow, the ill, the stranger, the alien, the slave. And if we don't do that, then we're selling our faith down the river. We're assimilating. We're refusing to speak difficult truths. And Troy has spent his career as a pastor speaking difficult truths. He's leaving University Christian Church to embark full-time on the work of working with evangelical Christians around issues like poverty and hunger and immigration, and getting evangelical Christians to be real advocates on issues of biblical justice. I admire Troy immensely, and I admire him for exactly that reason. I worry that the church sometimes is so concerned with making people comfortable that we are not challenging people enough. I admire this congregation precisely because you have stepped out in faith. You've tried to do something that was very different, that has a lot of risk attached, something that's going to be less attractive to large crowds of people, yet that's making a profound difference in this community, and particularly with the kids in this community. And at the same time, I think we do a pretty good job of taking care of each other. I admire that immensely. I believe that being a disciple of Jesus, I believe that being a person who tries to follow in his footsteps and do the will of God, live the way Jesus lives, also has to be responsible for speaking the way Jesus speaks. We have to be responsible for sharing the fullness of the gospel with the world. I worry desperately that our culture, for some reason, has stopped talking about some key and devastating issues. One of them is poverty. We have an African-American president who simply never talks about poverty. I'm glad that he's interested in the middle class, but what's happened in this country is that we have developed a class of people who live in multi-generational poverty. And the last person to ever speak about that on the political stage was John Edwards, who went down in flames for reasons of his own. And we can't talk about it anymore. We talk about jobs and employment because that gets us votes. I believe that the church needs to be a voice in relentlessly raising poverty as a crucial political and social issue. I believe the church needs to speak courageously, even if it alienates people who might be potential members. We need to speak courageously about our obligation as a society to pay attention to the problems of deep multi-generational poverty. And we have to do it not because we have a particular political slant, but because as followers of Jesus, we are directed in obedience to pay attention to the demands of biblical justice. Or to put it differently, we got to talk about this stuff because God demands we do something about it. God demands it of us as Christians. I'm not proposing particular approaches, I'm not proposing particular solutions, but I am proposing that if we're serious about our Christian faith, our voices have to be heard. We need to be raising issues of poverty and issues like them. How we treat the stranger and the foreigner, how we treat the fatherless and the widow. And I think in our own culture, the fatherless and the widow has its own shape. We are developing large swaths of our culture where children are not parented and where parents are caught by surprise and have no idea how to be parents. And that is exacerbated often by poverty. The fatherless and the widow, the people who do not have basic family structures, who don't have basic family nurturing abilities, exercise a demand upon the church that we raise this up and minister to it and think about it. And I don't believe we're called to think about it by simply reiterating a lot of old platitudes. What we need to do is exactly what this church is doing, but also exactly what Jesus demands we do in Matthew 26, where he says, go out there and give drink to the thirsty and food to the hungry, and experience me in the process. I think what the church is called to do is to be present in communities where there is poverty, where family structures have disintegrated, where basic family behaviors and nurturing have disintegrated. We need to go and be present there and experience there the presence of the Jesus who is infleshed in exactly those people whom our culture does not want to talk about, does not want to think about, does not want to pay attention to, and whose problems we would like to ignore. I'm not suggesting we raise words of condemnation about people's behavior. I'm suggesting we live and breathe and move with our neighbors and hear in their experience and in their voice Jesus' call upon our lives. Jesus spent his time moving around between the incredibly varied, may I say, multicultural communities of Galilee and Judea in the first century. He was there in the middle of it, looking at people, how people were suffering. And his teaching grows directly out of that experience and out of how God spoke to him and through him in that experience. He did not show up and simply reiterate the Levitical law. He was willing to bracket the law of Leviticus and to articulate God's mercy and justice in new ways that had never been expressed before. He was willing to look at what God gave through the prophets and reinterpret it so that it met the real needs of the people among whom he lived and among whom he walked, with whom he ate, whom he healed, and to whom he listened. What do we have to say? And how can we, our tiny little fellowship, say it in ways that others are energized by it and attracted to it? We do well. This church has shown by its actions and its behaviors and its commitments what we care about. But what are the ways that we could begin speaking well? Jesus healed, but he also taught. The prophet Jeremiah was commanded to speak the word that God gave him. I think sometimes we're afraid of speaking because we're not quite sure what we already think. We haven't put our own ideas together in a way that we find completely satisfying. I'm not sure Jesus had either. His words occur in different formulations and different accounts, and there's a kind of a living flexibility to them. And God said to Jeremiah, you don't have to have it all figured out. Just go out and speak courageously the word that you hear from me. So that's my challenge for us, is how can we begin speaking what we know to be true? How can we begin speaking to others the word that God is speaking to us? May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Let's just take a few minutes of quiet to reflect on the Scripture and what it has to say to us. And if anyone felt moved to speak or to pray,